Welcome to Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everyone, my name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and critic. Today I'm going to be talking to Helen O'Hara, editor-at-large at Empire magazine and the author of several books. Her latest book, Women vs. Hollywood, The Fall and Rise of Women in Film, is a superb read, and we shall be discussing that. Please remember, if you enjoy the episode, to like, subscribe, and generally spread the word as far and as wide as you possibly can. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the episode. The first thing I wanted to ask you about was more generally about your writing. How did you first get into writing about film? What was your first review?
My first review, I think, was on Ain't It Cool News, because they used to publish things sort of from anybody if you'd seen something that other people hadn't. And I was living in London, I was still a lawyer, and I signed up to one of those services that you sometimes got, preview tickets to see things through. So I saw, and I sometimes went to like London Film Festival screenings and things like that. So I saw, I think it was The Triplets of Belleville, or Belleville Rendezvous, as we call it here. Yeah, and I wrote a review of that. I think that was the very first one, actually. So it wasn't professional, it wasn't paid, it was just sort of, I saw it, I liked it, I thought I'd try writing about it, and I sent it into them, and they published it, as I remember. I haven't gone back and looked because I'm kind of terrified.
Right. And when did you start thinking, okay, I could do this as a job?
I don't know if I ever actually thought that. I went for the job, obviously. I went for an internship at Empire, and I was just sort of, I remember just trying to talk myself down the whole time, because I was like, look, you're not going to get this. Like, it's just it's not going to happen. You don't have any training, any experience. But I also thought, well, this is the time in my life to give it a go. So I sort of went for it anyway. But I never really thought I could, well, I don't know. I obviously thought I could do it. I remember being quite proud. I had to write a couple of sample news stories for the Empire website as part of that job application. And I remember thinking, all right, these are pretty much in the Empire style. Like, those feel like stories that I might have seen on Empire. So I was okay with those. But like, reviewing especially was kind of a hard thing to get into. And I was very grateful to the then reviews editor, Dan Jolin, I think it was, who... Actually, no, it wasn't Dan at the very beginning. But anyway, Dan came in pretty soon afterwards and sort of, talked me through those early reviews and gave me good feedback and helped me kind of polish up my my writing style.
And you've never looked back from then on?
Oh, I've looked back frequently, but no, I just keep trying to sort of polish up and keep reading other people's work and trying to be inspired by that and try to find new ways of talking about things and consider things in different ways and just try and get better all the time, I think. Yeah,
I think reading other people's work is really key.
Important. Yeah, really, really important. If when young people tell me they want to be a film journalist, I'm like, okay, what do you read? And I'm not necessarily saying who, because I wouldn't have been that nerd beforehand. I didn't know who was the section editor of each section of the magazine, and I probably should have done, actually, in retrospect. If I'd had journalistic training, that would have been the kind of thing I'd have looked out for. But I didn't know what section editors were or what they did. I didn't know particularly who were the writers of what. I vaguely knew the names because I read Empire so much, but it wasn't like I was kind of familiar with who everybody was. So I don't necessarily expect people to have kind of chapter and verse on like their top 10 favorite critics or something, but I do think you should be reading criticism if you want to get into this job. Equally, if you want to be a screenwriter, you should be reading screenplays. If you want to be a novelist, you should be reading novels. This is not new advice. If you read Stephen King on writing, it's basically chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and throughout. So it is incredibly important, but it's just standard, I think.
I mean, I think it's sometimes widely ignored because, I mean, personally, I definitely have a sort of a attraction and repulsion to other people's work because it's like, oh God, it's so much better than what I'm doing. So there's always that danger as well of not wanting to be cowed.
Exactly, yeah. It can be quite sort of scary, I think, sometimes when there are some people who read and you're like, that is light years away from where I am, light years. And that remains the case now, even as a professional of some God knows how many years. There are still some people I'm just like, how do you even do that? That's amazing. So, but also I think you should be inspired by that. Even if there are people who are well out of your league, all you can try and do is get better.
Getting into films at an early stage, were there any writers who you read who sort of inspired you, not necessarily even to write, but just stuff you liked reading?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I read a book called How to Read a Film in an attempt to understand, camera angles and things like that. And I'll be honest, I don't usually write very much about those, and I kind of feel like maybe I should. So I'm trying to kind of reread that at the moment. I then read the Anthony Lane book, Nobody's Perfect, which is a collection of his reviews from the New Yorker, which is fantastic. Even when I disagree with him, he's one of those writers that I just really enjoy reading. So that was really, really good fun. And yeah, I read a lot of sort of things like William Goldman's books, Adventures in the Screen Trade, and Bambi versus Godzilla by David Mamet, and Which Lie Did I Tell, also by William Goldman, and, a bunch of those kind of classics very early on. And then, it was just kind of reading, obviously, Empire and all my colleagues and all the other magazines that came into the office sometimes, and whatever I could really get my hands on just to try and see. And it is really kind of instructive sometimes to read the critics who you totally disagree with and just see where they're coming from. And often, it's somebody like an Anthony Lane or Robbie Collin at the Telegraph or somebody like that, I completely disagree with everything they're coming out with, but actually I find a lot of their reasoning compelling and I enjoy it, and it's well written and it's an entertaining read. So I think there's a value in criticism sometimes, even when it's criticism you disagree with and criticism that comes at it from a different perspective than you. I think this is something that maybe the internet has slightly sometimes overlooked, that there is value in it even when you disagree with the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's why, I kind of get a little bit wary of people who are too on the nose for me, that I agree with everything they write, so why am I reading it?
Yes, I know this. Yes, I like this. Yes, I'm aware.
Yeah. Stop telling me all stuff I already know. Yeah, Robbie, I know from various festivals, and we disagree about almost everything, I think. But it's great to have dinner with him after a film and just, okay, come on, why was that good or bad? Because it's a good conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's the conversation that I kind of enjoy in film criticism, and just the getting into, and of course there's different ways of having that conversation. There's the sort of more technical aspect of filmmaking, and the more sort of nuts and bolts of movie making. There's the very geeky conversations that we have in the Empire Spoiler podcasts about oftentimes it's elements of plot, it's elements of character, it's elements of translation from the source material that we focus on more, but they're all interesting ways of discussing films, and I just thoroughly enjoy them all. And then of course context, like how does this film fit into the context of our world? What does it say about us that we as a society have decided this is a good or a bad or a silly or an important film? So I think all of that is part of criticism and is what makes it interesting in and of itself, even beyond the material that it's discussing.
Yeah, absolutely, and the best critics always make you sort of walk away thinking beyond the film to the universe, if that's not too pretentious a thing to say. What about stepping from going towards writing a book? What was the sort of the inciting incident in that journey?
Well, I got kind of lucky, I think. Well, I got very lucky in several ways. So first of all, there's the fact that I wrote 2 books for Carlton Publishers, who were quite hands-off and the 2 books were quite similar to what I did day to day, in the sense that they were very much divided up into sections. They were very much, a sort of an essay or an article on each one of, I think, 50 films in one and 35 films and or franchises in another. And that made it a lot kind of easier to kind of digest. It was sort of writing 50 mini features rather than a book. which made it slightly less terrifying than it might otherwise have been. Coming on to this new book for Little Brown, Women versus Hollywood, that was a very much a horse of a different color. And I tried to sort of tell myself that it was kind of the same thing, that I was just writing some features, but it really wasn't, because each chapter was around about the 10,000 word mark, which is, you know, without giving any trade secrets away, considerably longer than most Empire features. That's up there with how much I ended up writing about all the Harry Potter films on the last movie. It was a very, very different beast. And while it helped to sort of be going chapter by chapter, and the fact that they were quite different subjects for each chapter and different focuses for each chapter, so there was a sort of a coherent blob, if you like, to tackle each time. Like, that blob was a lot bigger than anything I had tackled before, and the scope of each chapter actually could have been a book in itself. So I was laughably overambitious in what I tried to take on for this book. And so just getting to a point where I felt like I'd done enough research to even dare to write anything was one step. And then there was the point of getting to the point where I could stop writing, you know, and not feel like I was shortchanging everybody I was writing about. And I still, honestly, there's still people that I would like to have included in more depth, or, you know, gone off on a tangent about or added more nuance in about, because it's a huge subject. It is a laughably huge subject, and only a mad woman would attempt it. So, well, that's me, I guess. But yeah, it was, I mean, it was terrifying. This book was terrifying to write. I'm not going to lie.
I can imagine loads of people reading this book and just thinking, and being inspired and thinking, I want to do my PhD thesis on the bit of chapter 2 that really intrigued me, because as you say, they could then go into it, and there probably is a thesis or two per chapter, you know.
Oh, easily. I think, you know, there's huge amounts of writing out there already on each of these kind of areas, but there should be much more, because I think women in film generally is relatively understudied, and there are, you know, still the definitive books, I think, to be written on some of these women. So some of them obviously have great biographies and you know, think pieces and everything already, but some of them, I think there's still much more to say. I cannot wait. I hope that's the case. I was incredibly lucky with the books that there already are out there about these women, and I find, you know, I really enjoyed the research, you know, which was one of the reasons it was so hard to stop doing it. But, you know, when you're reading something like Lulu in Hollywood about Louise Brooks, which she wrote herself, Liberating Hollywood, which is all about the struggles of women in the 70s, I mean, which is a fantastic book. You know, these are great reads in themselves. From Reverence to Rape, again, another sort of book about the history of women in Hollywood. One of the great sort of overviews of women on the screen from Molly Haskell was fantastic. It just, Popcorn Venus, you know, just great, incredible books. A lot of those, especially those last two, focus more on what was on screen than what was happening behind the camera. But it's so I at least made my life slightly easier by just focusing really on what was, for the most part, what was off screen and what was happening in the professional lives of these women. But there's so much to say about their personal lives. There's so much to say about what their characters on screen were going through and why those choices were made. You know, I just think there's, yeah, it's tip of the iceberg stuff.
What struck me when I was reading was, and this is perhaps because I like writing screenplays as well, so I'm always on the lookout. And Hollywood is really big on the sort of self-examination of films like Mank was the most recent example of. And I look at some of these stories of these women, and I think this would be an amazing picture. This just the story of Mabel Normand, or just the story of Helen Gibson, the first stunt woman. That what a movie that would make.
Yeah.
But I can't think of any. I can't think of any sort of films about women who are not like
the glamorous stars, the Marilyns or the whoever.
Yeah, but even Marilyn, they always tend to film Marilyn via some bloke. It's always like her romances, or you know, my week with Marilyn. It's some oblique.
Well, hopefully the Ana de Armas film will slightly rebalance that, I hope, because she's a fascinating character and I don't think she has had her due. There's a mention briefly in the book, but Mimi Leder wanted to make a film about Frances Marion, who was the first writer to win 2 Oscars and was a hugely important figure in sort of late silent, early talkie era Hollywood. And there was absolutely no studio interest, according to her, just none. She could not get it off the ground. And I suspect that has been the case with a lot of these stories. And I suspect that there's been a lot of that. And I hope that that's going to change, because I think, there was a fair amount of attention to Be Natural, the Alice Guy Blaché documentary. I believe there's a new documentary, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm really excited about Lois Weber. So those two, in particular, and they get a lot of room in my book because they were two huge figures of the silent era, but they are kind of beginning to see their legacies sort of brought back to life, if you will. And I think that gives me hope that there's going to be a little bit of an upswell in interest in some of these stories, and we might get to see a sort of a Monk-esque film about some of these women. Like Ida Lupino, that one should be an easy one, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
She had the most extraordinary life, came to Hollywood to be a star. They decided when she got there that she was too old to play Alice in Wonderland, which is what they brought her there to do. Got polio, survived polio, but she got dropped by her studio while she was there. Then, forced her way back to stardom, essentially, and spent all her time on set learning how to make movies, and made herself into a director, and did manage to have a career, and did manage to make a couple of, really great movies, and was determined to kind of buck the trends of the time and make quite serious kind of issue films. That's pretty extraordinary. And she's gorgeous. So, come on, Hollywood. That one's a gimme, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a no-brainer.
Absolutely nailed on.
Who would be your sort of personal heroine you've sort of discovered during your research and you'd like a lot more people to know about?
I do like, I didn't get as much into their private lives as I wanted to, but all those kind of stunt women, the Helen Gibson, but all of them, there was a whole raft of women making those movies, and I think that's incredible. Given the extremely primitive safety techniques of the time, I think they were incredible, and I think there's got to be a story there. Nell Shipman, for the same reason, she's the one who went off to essentially not far off the North Pole to shoot a movie, but I think she's amazing. I don't know. There's a lot of, obviously you go back in history, there's a lot of imperfections in terms of people's outlook on things. So Lois Weber's films on birth control are really eugenicist in some ways, and not very okay. But at the same time, she was trying to grapple with something, and by the standards of her time, she was trying to be progressive. So do we give her credit for that, or do we condemn her by the standards of ours? Same with Alice Guy Blaché. She made what's believed to be the first film with an all-black cast, certainly in the US, and it's a mess and it's racist. But by the standards of the time, the fact that she made it was quite radical. So does she get some points? Maybe, but probably not that many, So I don't know if I have uncomplicated heroines, but there's definitely some intriguing figures, and at least as intriguing as the men, who we could kind of do with learning more about. One of
the things that I took away from it, not the main thing, but one of the things I took away from the book was there is an injustice here to the women involved, and to the women who wanted to have a career in Hollywood and were dissuaded by the circumstances and by the structures that were in place. But on top of that, there's also an injustice to the spectators, because we've not got 20 Ida Lupino films or 50, comparative to a man who would be in working in that similar period. Are there any of those careers that you think were stopped? Do you sense missing masterpieces there that if only there could have been a...
Yeah, very much. Anita Luce is the one who comes to mind, the screenwriter. She wrote Gentlemen Frere Blondes, which is one of my all-time favorite musicals. I just adore it. Without any hesitation. I love that film. And her career was kind of stymied, actually not so much by the studios, who actually valued her talent, but by the fact that her husband really resented it and kept sort of rather theatrically coming up with diseases basically every time she had a bit of success. So they had a very strange and strained relationship, and I kind of think that definitely held her back. So I would have loved to have seen what she could have done, with just more support, more time, more less sexist nonsense. So there is one, but this is absolutely a problem. All of those directors, Dorothy Arzner, Lois Weber, Ida Lupino, they all gave up before their time. All the women of the 70s who'd never really got their foot in the door, when they did. They were so compromised and second guessed and questioned with everything they did. That goes up to the present day. There are women working nowadays who still have to wait years between films and who still find every every decision they make questioned by the people above them and around them and even below them. So it's a real problem. We were actually discussing this today because we're doing the Empire podcast this afternoon. I mean, this is a spoiler as I say this to you. It will not be a spoiler by the time this goes out, but we're about to discuss which directors would be on your personal Mount Rushmore. And personally, they're all white men.
Right.
Because the female directors that I love, generally speaking, I love because of one or two of their films. And the other ones maybe I admire, or I like, but I don't love. And the directors with the highest hit rate of things that I absolutely adore, because they have made more films, are generally men. So, I'm very torn as I speak to you about, do I put one of the women in there anyway? Or do I be honest and say that my personal Mount Rushmore right now in 2021 is still pretty much white men?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that on Twitter the other day, people were posting 4 pictures of great directors. Obviously, a whole bunch of them were just white guys.
Yeah.
And then I noticed there was a trend to start putting Celine Sharma in, and it was just is that the first person you could think? If this was 20 years ago, you would have been putting in Jane Campion.
Yep.
And it's,
or 10 years ago, it would have been Catherine Bigelow. It just
right.
And look, I admire those directors. I do, and I love, if Catherine Bigelow was on and she's probably the one who came closest to my personal Mount Rushmore, and that's entirely on the basis of Point Break. I like The Hurt Locker a lot, but is it in my top 100 favorite films of all time? No. Are there 7 Rob Reiner films in my top 100 films of all time? Yes, probably. And Spielberg and the Coens. And probably Billy Wilder. That's probably my 4 at the moment. I'm counting the Coens as one. That's okay, right? I think.
Yeah.
But Chloe Zhao in a few more years, if she goes on at the pace she's going, absolutely may well have a place on that hill. But right now, I admire her. I have loved The Rider. I have loved Nomadland. But that's kind of it. So we need more from all of these women. And I feel like right now, I have seen, I'll be honest, I'm not as comprehensive as I would like to be on Agnes Varda. I've been doing a little bit of a dive into her stuff, but she's very much of the French New Wave, and none of the male directors there made my list. And, she does not,
Yeah.
So I feel like a bit of a gender traitor and a bit of a failure, but at the same time, if we're talking about what I personally love, it is mostly the films of men, because they have made most of the films.
Right. And they've made them under the most favourable circumstances possible.
Yeah, with the biggest stars and the best scripts and the biggest budgets. So what are you going to do?
And even, as you were saying, even up to the present day, you can have someone who's a very successful filmmaker as a woman, but, they only need one misstep, and the consequences seem to be much more traumatic than almost someone like Spielberg can do 1941, or Scorsese can do New York, but heaven forfend you do an Ishtar and
Oh, Ishtar makes me so cross. Actually, Elaine May's not a bad shot. She's got a great hit rate. But both of those directors did briefly go to director jail after those movies you mentioned, to be fair to them. However, the difference is in length of sentence, and certainly as regards Ishtar, the difference is marked. And I think in some ways, and we can have, that's a whole other conversation, 1941 was kind of the making of Spielberg, because it really forced him to knuckle down and be very, very disciplined with himself in future, which I think helped his career after that point. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a marked difference in how men and women are treated in movie jail, and how long their sentences are, and the likelihood of them ever recovering, really. I mean, Mimi Leder went, 18 years after Pay It Forward, which seems a lot. I mean, she was working in TV, and some of that time she may have just given up on features and just thought, you know what, I've got a great TV career, fine. But again, was that entirely out of choice, or was that things like this Frances Marion biopic just not finding any takers? And I think there's a lot of that going on. There is, when you're a female director or you want to make a film about a female lead, you already have a higher hill to climb, and you already have a tougher job convincing studio executives that this is something that might connect with people and might matter to people, because all they see is, oh, but it's about a woman and I'm not a woman and I don't see why that's important. That seems niche. I mean, women are literally treated as a sort of a niche subject, and that's the fundamental problem here. Women are treated like a minority, and that's not the case. You get into these ridiculous situations where you've got studio bosses going, well, I don't think anybody would go see that because they wouldn't go see it, and again, this is something I talk a little bit about in the book, but I noticed for several years in a row, we'd keep getting these female-led hits that would be treated as sleeper hits. Like, oh my God, who thought this would be such a big hit? And it was stuff like Eat, Pray, Love, which was based on a phenomenally best-selling book. It was stuff like Mamma Mia, which was based on a phenomenally successful musical, and things like Twilight. And they were going, oh, who could have seen this coming? I'm like, I could have. I mean, I don't think I'm alone, but I'm not saying I'm special, but I could have seen that those would be hits. But each time it was kind of particularized and treated as this one-off, unreplicable events. And I think it's a similar sort of thing with directors as well. Each time one of them succeeds, they're treated as the exception. Each time a female director succeeds, it's an exception. She's a one-off, instead of, and whereas if a man fails, he's treated as just, well, that happens sometimes to people, doesn't it? No big deal. Brush yourself off, try again. Whereas if a woman fails, it's like all women are bad. It is a genuine disconnect. It's a genuine problem, and Hollywood is only really just now beginning to grapple with it to any significant degree.
I mean, it is true that it seems like Hollywood is trailing behind a complete change in trends in terms of the audience. I mean, I notice this. I teach, and I notice this in my classes, that 20, 30 years ago, if you say, oh, who's into science fiction or who's into this type of movie, it would have been split very much in favor of the boys. But nowadays, the vast majority of geeks, let's say, are women, and it's because they've been brought up on Harry Potter, Twilight, and Hunger Games. Yeah. So you've got a large part of the audience for superhero movies and what have you who are no longer this exclusive boys club.
But I mean, it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? Because, where are those boys, dominating fandoms because the fandoms were only talking to them? I've always loved sci-fi and fantasy. That's always been kind of my home genres, right, if you will. And that's because I grew up in a house where my dad had, first of all, bookshelves full of them. Absolutely full of them, but he also had bookshelves full of books written by women, because my granny and my aunt were into it as well, and so we had loads of Anne McCaffrey books, and we had loads of Lois McMaster Bujold books, and there were women in my sci-fi novels and my fantasy novels who were amazing and who were cool, and there were, to be stereotypical, there were love stories, there were interpersonal problems, there were all sorts of very, very relatable things, and it wasn't just the sort of Robert Heinlein-y, here is the make and model of my laser rifle, and here is all the detail of the troop disposition kind of stuff. Sci-fi and fantasy are much, much wider than that, and I was lucky enough to be brought up in that kind of breadth of sci-fi and fantasy. And the thing is that mainstream, or what was treated as mainstream sci-fi and fantasy, was the kind of Heinlein-y, Asimov-y, Clarke-y, incredibly blokey stuff. And if you read that now, like, it's embarrassing how bad their women are. Yeah. These guys, like Arthur C. Clarke, literally thought up stuff that now exists in real life. He was able to envision technology that now exists and did not exist in his time, because he was that far ahead of the curve in the science. And his women are still unbelievably shit because he couldn't conceive of women being equal to men, and it makes his books embarrassing. And that's kind of how films are going to be, right, looking back. Right. And it's already happening when you look back at some of the 80s movies and you see the way they talk about LGBT people, or you see some of the racism in some of these movies. You see, Dan Aykroyd in blackface and Trading Places, and you're like, oh God, I love this movie, but no, I don't love this. It's already happening. These things are already changing. And if you want to be future-proof, you should be talking to the whole audience and not just to white men. We did a film club with Blade Runner recently with the university, and again, my film club, 100% women. All the girls turn up, and the thing that we spent about a third of the
couple of hours that we talk, we spent a third of the time talking about the love scene, the love scene, air quotes,
and whether or not that's rape.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just found it so interesting that it was that we were having this conversation, but I also found myself thinking, I really wish that wasn't in the film, because it does, it kind of screws up the film. And I gave a really elaborate potential out, saying, well, if he's a replicant, then he doesn't know anything about consent, and he doesn't know anything about anything. And so, and it's like, and I was not convinced. Even as I heard my own voice, I was thinking, no, John, no.
Yeah, it's exactly that kind of thing, that it's just, but you know what gets me, actually? It's not Blade Runner. I mean, Blade Runner is Blade Runner. It's of its time. And yes, that scene is in there, and it's at best troubling, at best. But, you always have to have your filter on for these things in the 80s and go, I'm not, I'm going to enjoy what I enjoy, and I'm going to think about the problematic stuff later, a little bit. What gets me is Blade Runner 2049, actually. And it gets me that every sex worker we see in that movie appears to be a woman. It gets me that, what was Ana de Armas? Was she Love or the other one? Joy. She was Joy.
She wasn't Lovejoy, was she? She wasn't Lovejoy.
There's Love and Joy. But like Ana de Armas's Joy, she's obviously the companion AI, whatever. We see into other people's apartments. Sometimes we see adverts in the street. Couldn't they have also been advertising a male Joy equivalent? Like, I'm not talking change the focus, even change the lineup of characters. I'm talking about in the background, build the fact that women exist into your world as more than just kind of playthings of men. And those two things, the fact that, and this was a summer that really got to me because there were about 4 different sci-fi movies, which, in these futuristic landscapes all had female or female coded sex workers who were working for male or male coded characters. And there was no nuance. There was no acknowledgement that society might change or might move on. I mean, and people say, oh, well, Helen, it's a dystopia in Blade Runner. It's not supposed to be some gender equality paradise. I would submit to you that having male sex workers does not make it a gender equal paradise. It's still pretty fucking dystopian because you've still got sex workers right there. And so I don't think that there's still somebody being exploited, whatever way you look at it. I just think it would acknowledge that people other than straight men exist in this reality. It was Blade Runner 2049 that summer. It was Guardians of the Galaxy 2. And it was Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, and I think something else. And they all have this trope in it, and it really upset me.
It's like the limits of male imagination, isn't it? It's going back to Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein.
Yes.
I can imagine a weird spaceship, but I can't imagine different relationships with men and women.
And if you're going to call yourself a visionary director, which they did for Blade Runner 2049, then have a vision and consider half of humanity in that vision. In fact, you know what? Go ahead and consider all of humanity, and think about different cultures and think about different races and think about different religions and everything as well, because a lot of that is obviously also missing. I'm not saying women are the only or the most put upon in these scenarios, but they are also disincluded here. And it would be nice if filmmakers, especially those who are trying to see into the future, would acknowledge that.
It's a tell, isn't it? It's a real tell.
Yeah,
that,
really is.
I just can't. That's one thing I can't get over. I can get, I can see flying cars and stuff, but I can't see anything else in terms of relationships. Yeah. I mean, this leads us on to the context of the book being published at a moment in which sort of Me Too and the discussion about exploitation. And now we're recording this just after the Noel Clarke sort of allegations have come out as well. I think last time I talked to you, I actually asked if this was tailing off. And it seems no, it isn't. Thankfully in the sense that it's being relieved, not thankfully in the sense that it's still going on. I'm not asking for like an end point to this, but you would think that there would be some sort of structural reforms at the highest levels and all the way through the film industry to sort of just start vetting people a little bit more, because none of this seems to be shocking and surprising when it ends up coming out. I'm thinking specifically of BAFTA giving Noel Clarke a big award.
Yeah, I think, there's a bunch of different things raised by that question. I think. So first of all, there's the fact that a lot of the allegations against Noel Clarke, we should be fair, are historic. So, they predate the Me Too movement. So, that obviously wasn't something that people were necessarily aware of at the time when they were complained of. And that old, don't worry about it kind of structure was very much still in place for a lot of those alleged incidents. Second of all, there's the fact that judging by the extent of the allegations against Noel, the number of people that they came from, and also the letter signed by, I think, 800 people that followed in the wake of those allegations, just calling for basically better treatment within the British film industry as a whole, that suggests to me that, first of all, that, the UK didn't really have Me Too. There weren't a lot of, British people caught up in that. There wasn't a lot of, I think, reckoning here. And there certainly wasn't any kind of house clearing of, of anybody of that level as Harvey Weinstein. So it may be that we didn't really deal with it at the time. And maybe, and I hope maybe we will now. But I think the bigger issue, and the issue for a lot of this, and this is me slightly giving voice to an excuse that is often made, but I don't want to give it as an excuse. I want to just discuss it as a factor. The studios and people in the studios will often say there is no, central authority. There is no central board here. There is no one who can weigh up the allegations and investigate and take action to ensure that certain people don't work in the industry again if they can't be trusted around women. And this is not just Noel Clarke. It has nothing to do with him. This is a general comment about the UK film industry and indeed the US film industry. There is nobody who determines whether or not you get to keep making movies and whether or not you can be trusted. BAFTA's whole line was, we don't have the resources to investigate this. We can't. They felt that they couldn't act on a rumor. I would maybe dispute that, but they felt that was the case. And they also felt they didn't have the resources and they didn't have the ability to investigate, which again, I would maybe quibble with, but that was their position. And there is something to that. There is no person who is currently, authorized to get into this stuff. So you're relying on each production, whether big budget or tiny budget, of having someone who is competent, trained, equipped, authorized, empowered to investigate, to take action against sometimes their own employers. And that kind of powerful HR person doesn't exist in the biggest companies in the world, let alone the kind of ad hoc assemblages of people who are set up to make films. Now, this is not to excuse the industry, because I think there is a lot more that could be done. I think the guilds and so on of professional guilds could maybe do more. I think certainly producers should be doing more to protect crew on their own productions. But there probably is a case that they do need some more support, or at least training, or at least standardized operating procedures in order to be able to effectively do that. So, for example, and this is, again, something I wrote about a little bit in the book, but the idea of bringing in rules about sex scenes and intimate content and intimacy coordinators, that's really a step in the right direction, I think. And I think it is helping to make those scenes slightly less loaded for a lot of people. But that only works if the intimacy coordinator is empowered, is supported by the producers, is supported by the production to be able to protect the vulnerable people inside. And it only works if they brought in the intimacy coordinator in the first place, which obviously is now becoming standard in a lot of contracts, but it's not universal yet. So you need something like that. You need a code of conduct. You need it to be stuck to. You need it to be enforced by the industry in some fashion, maybe by distributors, like Netflix and Amazon did with intimacy coordination and SAG did in the US. That's the kind of thing that needs to happen to kind of force, essentially, in the nicest possible way, all these productions to actually protect the people who work for them. But it is not a simple thing, and I don't mean to suggest that it is. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to be done, and it doesn't mean it can't ever happen. But the very first step is having the conversation. So I think that's still where we are, and I think that's true of the US as well as here. I think we're still mostly in step one, acknowledging that this is a problem and we need to do something about it. Step two, doing something about it, is very much still to come. And it's only really when we've done that the sort of the Me Too movement will have actually done its job.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, and then you mentioned it, the guilds and the unions, because ultimately it's about protecting your members. It's about it's not about going out and catching people. It's about making sure that no one has to submit to this. Yeah. And then, if you catch people in the process, then so be it. I think Me Too, and I think this conversation generally has been a very, very positive thing, and it's forcing a lot of people to rethink, and sometimes that rethinking is also unconscious. I remember once getting on the wrong side of an argument by just really casually referring to Louis C.K. as a victim. Oh, he's been the victim, and then no, I didn't mean he was the victim, but that unconscious bias needs to come out. That's the last thing I wanted to say, the last thing I wanted to express. But why is the collocation there? Why is that the word that immediately affixes? So hopefully that ongoing will happen.
Well, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, I think there is this not just British, but particularly British sense of fair play. And so, a lot of people after the Noel Clarke allegations came out sort of went, well, he's innocent until proven guilty, which is, of course, 100% correct. He is absolutely innocent until proven guilty. Who's going to prove him guilty? I mean, that's not a thing that's going to happen. A lot of the allegations weren't even criminal, so there's no question of being proven guilty. That doesn't necessarily work as something to shut down conversation, because that shuts down conversation maybe too much. So it's really hard to know what the next step is in a lot of these cases. And we do have this very, I think in most cases, commendable desire to give people the benefit of the doubt, to give people, as I say, to give people the credit that they are innocent until proven guilty, to give people second chances and allow them, slip ups. I think there's a very, 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 very big swell of feeling among not all men, but many men, that a lot of what is sometimes complained of as being sexual harassment or, inappropriate comments and stuff like this, there's a big feeling of, I understand why he said that. He thought it was funny. I think it's funny. He should not be hauled over the coals for that. And I think that happens a lot. And we all say that sometimes. We all think, well, that's not that big a deal. You could shrug that off, but we don't necessarily know the whole context. And it may be that the way it was said, the moment it was said, the circumstances in which it was said were genuinely frightening or genuinely upsetting or whatever else. So there's a lot going into all this, and we do have these, I think, understandable and even commendable urges to sympathize with people who have been accused of something, because we know that we might also have said the wrong thing at times. We know that we might also have gotten drunk and, I don't know, grabbed somebody at some point, and maybe we did it in a gross way, and we don't know because we were super drunk at the time. I'm teetotal. I don't know how that works, but I'm sure it does. But so we're all very, very conscious of our own failings, and we project that onto others, and we say, well, we've got to give them the benefit of the doubt because we would want the benefit of the doubt as well. But the thing is, at some point, and this is something I discuss in the book as well, I think it's better to be a little bit hypocritical and condemn behavior that we think is now beyond the pale and that we think is now harassment, rather than keeping on always giving the benefit of the doubt to everybody, even after numerous cases of bad behavior. The Mel Gibson cases, for example, on the Hangover part, was it 2 that he was hired for? There were lots of crew members who were apparently saying, well, he should be given a second chance. I mean, by that point, it was his 3rd or 4th, or I don't know. But they obviously felt, well, I might have gotten drunk and said something sexist to a cop or whatever. So I want him to have the same mercy I would have. Yeah,
sexist is one thing. Holocaust denierist.
I 100%. Like I'm not. I don't. My point here is not to diminish what he did, but sure. You know what I mean. I think that's the way people talk about these things. They sort of think, well, I might have said something sexist to somebody. I might have grabbed at somebody. I might have done that. So I want him to have the same benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, like, we have to stop doing that, because we keep giving these people the benefit of the doubt, and they keep preying on people. And we're doing this thing where we keep empathizing with the accused, but we're not empathizing enough with the victims. And we need to do a little bit more of that before we can fairly empathize with the accused as much as we currently do. Because I think that's what's been missing. There's been this tendency over the years, and really up until Me Too, and I think this was the big kind of psychological change of Me Too, was that the casting couch and this idea that as standard almost, powerful men would prey on young, beautiful women was laughed off. And that was taken as just a fact of life. Powerful men prey on young women. They ask them out. Young women probably want to go out with them because young women probably want their money. And this was just what people thought. And I think that's been the shift of Me Too. People have been forced to interrogate those assumptions and forced to think, actually, what if that's not the case? And that's what kind of gives me hope for the future, because I think that's where things are beginning to change a little bit. And we're beginning to see that, no, that's not what's happening here.
I mean, it goes back to the what we were saying about Blade Runner as well. It seems to be a lack of imagination. It's like we've got one way of thinking about how power should express itself. Look at Scott Rudin recently. You throw things around, you shout, you scream, and then Whiplash style. It's left ambiguous. Were you a monster, or did you teach me an important life lesson? Why is that the only way to have a portrait of a powerful person?
Yeah.
Or it can be, if it's a woman who's a powerful person, then it has to be a Meryl Streep The Devil Wears Prada. And it just seems so limited to see power in that way.
Yeah.
And destructive.
I think that's 100% true. Yeah. Very, very destructive. And I think this is the problem. And it's something that I think women who came up through this system have kind of grappled with. Like one of the books I read before writing this was about Sherry Lansing, who was one of the first big, female studio heads. And she came up through the system and was often assumed to have been sleeping with her boss, and she had to make her way despite that. Her contemporary Dawn Steele was incredibly tough talking, hard drinking, hard swearing. If there was room for one woman in the room, she was going to be it, and she was going to be one of the lads, and that was her path to the top. And both of them really had to, I think, grapple with the way that they were perceived and the way that they were able to be the one woman who succeeded, because there was not room for more than one at the time. And it was very, 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 very limited numbers of women who were allowed to succeed. And yes, that's because we have this male version of what power looks like, what success looks like, what ambition looks like, what competence looks like, actually. If you think about the way that directors are spoken about and treated, there are certain directors, and I don't need to name them because you know exactly who they are, but like Oscar nominees in recent years who were notorious for having on-set tantrums and going crazy at people. And yet they keep getting stars to work with them, and they keep getting, Oscar attention and people to fund their films and everything else. And then there'll be female directors who will just have a moment one day and need some time out, or need to cry, or need to just take a second to think about things. And suddenly there are dits and they can't make up their mind, and they can't be trusted, and they're too emotional. What's okay and what isn't? And I think we do have this massive double standard in how men and women are allowed to act and still be treated as powerful, or as competent even, or as emotional. How we're allowed to be emotional is very, very male coded.
And I did have to say, I heart the way you referred to a director but didn't say his name. I imagine
no idea who you mean.
On a sort of more positive note, I mean, this is all a positive note, I think, because, it can be painful making changes. And I sometimes think a lot of the resistance to this is just laziness. It's just about, it's just like, think before you speak, or learn how people hear what you're saying and adjust your behavior accordingly, deal with the consequence. I mean, that to me is just like maturity, isn't it? It's not that difficult. I mean,
never heard of it, mate. No idea.
So going towards looking towards the future and looking towards, and you've already mentioned Chloe Zhao, and there are examples of Patty Jenkins as well, getting into of a higher level in terms of budget and in terms of different genres. Are you fairly optimistic about the future, or do you think there's going to need to be even more changes?
There do need to be more changes. There absolutely do. And some of those that we talked about in terms of just kind of formalizing the industry and making it a little bit more up to date in terms of protecting people definitely needs to be in there. Also, in terms of equal pay, that needs to be a part of the conversation as well. So yes, that all needs to happen. And let's be honest, the percentage of, let's say, female directors, also female composers, cinematographers, you name it, is still way too low, way too low. But the reason I have hope, and the reason I think things are moving in the right direction, broadly speaking, is that I think there are signs that Hollywood is now taking this seriously. I think there are women now getting big jobs and getting second chances as well. Wonder Woman 1984 might not have performed quite as well as they hoped, but Patty Jenkins will be back for the third one, and Patty Jenkins is making a Star Wars movie, and these are great, great things. Ava DuVernay's A Wrinkle in time didn't do quite as much at the box office as they hoped, but she is not obviously in director jail and has done great work, for example, on TV with When They See Us and so on since, and is still very much part of the conversation for the big movies that come up. I'm excited for Chloe Zhao's Eternals. I'm super excited for that. I'm super excited for, you know, Kate Shortland's Black Widow, and the fact that this may open doors to her that were previously out of her kind of budget range, or her perceived budget range. I think the fact that these women are getting these big opportunities is really significant. Now, yes, these are a tiny minority of female directors, and yes, they are not necessarily the most outspoken, the ones who have been complaining about this the most. You know, somebody like Lexi Alexander, who has really put herself on the line to argue for better treatment of female directors, is still not obviously gaining any benefit from having done that. So there's still a long way to go. But the fact that these women are getting these opportunities, the fact that there are many of them, and it's not just one a year anymore, that matters. And it means that we might get to a point where they have built up the kind of CVs that men have always been allowed to build, and they build up enough power and enough of their own money that they can go off and they can make their small personal projects and win Oscars and so on, and we can begin to change that Oscar picture a little bit further as well. These things are beginning to happen, and they're happening too slowly, and they're happening at far too limited a level. But the fact that it's also happening at the top end of the budgetary market is really heartening, because quite frankly, we saw in the 90s, you could have as many mid-budget hits as you want, and it doesn't move the needle. This might move the needle a little bit more, and that's my big hope.
Yeah, that sort of independent, sort of mid-range $10 million movie.
All those rom-coms, you know, all those kind of like even something like Wayne's World. You can make a hit with Wayne's World, but it doesn't mean you get to come back for the sequel.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm definitely not going to edit this out. I'm going to keep this in because this is gold. me thinking of a question. And then
I do this all the time in interviews. All the time.
No, I don't want to ask that question. That's a stupid question. It's better that it's gone. I got it back, and it wasn't worth stretching to get it. Right. What I would like to do, sort of to end off the interview, is to ask you for a book recommendation. For anybody who's interested in reading film books, which I'm assuming everybody who's listening to this will be.
I hope so. This is tough. Like I say, there's a lot I've already mentioned. So let me see if I've got something else. I stand by all the ones I already mentioned.
Sure.
Oh, here's one. It's quite hard to get, but if you can find it, I think it's amazing. It's called Dreams and Nightmares by Bob McCabe, the late great Bob McCabe. And it's about Terry Gilliam and the Brothers Grimm. You don't have to be a fan of the Brothers Grimm to enjoy it, but I think it's really, really good on sort of one of Gilliam's troubled productions.
which is the same as saying one of Terry Gilliam's films.
One of Terry Gilliam's films, yes. Look, I mean, his latest one I didn't love. But and I didn't love the Brothers Grimm, but it's a fascinating book on just what kind of went on behind the scenes and the kind of interference and conversation that went on. And I thought that was great. The other one I really adore, and again, this might be hard to get hold of. I don't know how widely available these are, but this is Doctor Who, The Writer's Tale, The Final Chapter, by Russell T Davies and Benjamin Cook. And as I understand it, basically Benjamin Cook started writing to Russell T Davies, you know, as a Doctor Who fan, and they ended up discussing basically every episode of Russell T Davies's work on Doctor Who. And it's just fascinating to see how things changed, how things, you know, were sharpened up in the writing process, how ideas kind of mutated into what we see on screen. And I just think it's really, really fascinating, and just, you know, well written and charming and very personable as well. So yeah, those are two of my favorites, apart from all the ones that I have already mentioned.
Yeah, you mentioned some of my favorite books earlier as well. I went through I mean, I used to read film books because where I was living, we couldn't really get to the cinema that often. So I would often especially those big like encyclopedia of science fiction or encyclopedia of cult movies, and you would just be like, I can't imagine what this even looks like. How could anyone, you know? And then the legend would build about the movie, and I'd watch it, and often
sometimes a letdown, right?
often, or sometimes a letdown, but like in the case of, I don't know, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it was like way beyond what I had imagined. I was like, this is hot. This is so horrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a film. Even today, I watch it and I have to stand up and walk around. I can't, watch it all
It's
the
a
way
bit much.
through. Yeah.
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 I think I've managed to sit through that once, but that's it. And I'm okay with never going back, quite frankly.
I revisited it really recently, and I kind of forced myself to watch it because it's a real. I first watched it when I was like 11 or 12, and much too young. And a friend of mine, his parents were coming home for lunch, so we were watching it in the morning on his video, and then he said, "Oh God, it's 11:30. You better go. Mum and Dad will be home soon." And so I had to leave it without seeing the ending.
No.
And so I was like, "Oh no, I should have seen the ending when they killed the monster, because that way I
Some kind
would."
of catharsis, right?
Exactly. But of course, when I did watch it, they don't kill the monster.
No.
It's still open ended. So it was a great, that's one of my favorite films in a weird way, just because it's so visceral, It
Yeah.
still has that effect. Listen, Helen, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you.
I was sort of hesitant about asking you because I saw on Twitter as well, you do so many podcasts. I was thinking, oh, you're going to be so sick to the back
I have been
teeth.
on, yeah. It's more. It's not that I quite enjoy doing the podcast. It's more when I tweet about them, I'm conscious that people must be like, "Oh my God, she's on another fucking podcast." Are you kidding me? Because it does feel like it's been about every week since February, probably. It's been close to that.
How's the book done?
I don't know really. I think
Right.
it seems to have done quite well. The publisher seems quite pleased, but I
Right.
don't know what counts as even good or bad these days. But the book of the week thing on Radio 4, I think was really encouraging. So I think that gave it a bit of a bump. But it's one of those things where, yes, it was book of the week and that was great, but it wasn't. The shops weren't open at the time, so it wasn't like somebody heard it on Radio 4 in the morning and then was able to just toddle off and happen to pick up a copy in the afternoon. So I don't know if that means that it didn't get as much of a bump as it would normally do.
I think you'd be surprised. I think they'd all buy it on Amazon or
maybe
wherever else. I've got an agent and he tells me the book trade has actually been
good.
boosted.
Okay, well that would be nice. My editor was quite happy with me, so I think it's a good sign, right? Although I did suggest her recently, I sort of went, "Oh, I think I've got an idea for a second one," and she just has not picked up on that at all. So I'm like,
that's a bit, but that's not right. That you need to send another email straight away saying, "Come on, what is your idea?" If you
Well, this is very, very, very early days. I haven't figured out how to write it, but I thought it'd be interesting to talk about who the bad guys are in Hollywood. So in different eras, like what the different bad guys have kind of been or represented. Communists or communism, unionism probably as well, gangsters and aliens, and just what do the bad guys say about us, essentially? Because the reason I thought of this is because recently I have been incredibly annoyed at the trend that Hollywood has to make environmentalists or environmentalism the reason that bad guys do what they do. Thanos actually is quite a good example, but like he's doing it because he wants to save the world, but he's killing off half of humanity to do it. Hobbs and Shaw, I think, had the same motivation. Venom had the same freaking motivation. I mean, what? Not Venom personally, but Riz Ahmed character in Venom. So it's like it's really common now to have, the bad guy wants to save the world by in some way getting rid of, enslaving, or wiping out half of humanity. And I'm not here for it, and I don't think it's okay. And so that kind of got me thinking about this issue. But, you go back and you have all the terrorists of the early noughties and you have the commies of the 80s and so on. So just
Eastern European gangster from Kazakhstan.
And who all the terrorists are through the years, because obviously there's quite a lot to say about some of the Northern Irish terrorists as well. So I just think, but it's figuring out how to do it. Do you go era by era? Do you go kind of subject by subject? And then do you count So I would argue that women tend to be bad guys because they're women sometimes, but there's now beginning to be a trend of toxic men being bad guys because they're toxic, because of toxic masculinity. So that would probably go in one chapter. But do you put in the sort of gay and trans panic in that same chapter? Probably. So gender and sex being kind of one chapter. Big business, when is it a bad guy? When is it not? Weirdly, I think it's often a bad guy in kids' movies of the 80s. But it's rarely a bad guy like in movies now, which is bizarre, really bizarre.
I always had the feeling that Hollywood tended to identify the people that it wanted to sort of take power away from, and it would invert the power pyramid, you know. So the obvious example is like the American Indian, the native indigenous people. They become the huge threat, which kind of helps us to get rid of them. And then the femme fatale becomes a threat in the post-war period, because the men are coming back from war and suddenly women have got
have had jobs and they're like, what the fuck? This is my job.
And they've got they've got a life, they've got a bigger life. Or even like the late 80s, early 90s sort of erotic thriller, the men kill their wives much more than Glenn Close, and that sort of Sharon Stone with an ice pick.
Exactly. So that's kind of what I want to get into. So I think it could be, good. And the nice thing about this would be, I'd still have to read some books, of course, but mostly I'd have to watch movies.
Hey, and that's what we're here for.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time, Helen.
Pleasure as always. Thank you.
So that was my conversation with Helen O'Hara. Her book, Women vs. Hollywood, The Fall and Rise of Women in Film, is available everywhere and comes highly recommended. Thanks very much to Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the artwork. Please like and subscribe and do all the things that you have to do to make this as big as possible. But until next week, that's all for us at the Writers on Film podcast. Take care.